Generous introduction and organization of this event, and I hope we do more of this. We do this in the States and have done it for years. This is kind of an outgrowth that started. Many of you know that Jay Gunkelman does his rounds and that Yuri does his, and then mine evolved naturally from that as a metabolic side of brainwaves. So I have great respect for these guys, and you can see my where is it? Gunkel Bobble right over here.
Yeah.
My brain over here. But the concept is a simple one. I've been a chiropractic neurologist in practice for 30 years, and I've been a professor and a mentor for a number of interns that have come through the university in Minneapolis. And I've also taught for the Carrick Institute. Many of you know what the Carrick Institute is, the functional neurology group. I serve on the American Chiropractic Neurology Board, and I'm on the exam committee, so I help prepare the exam every year, which is a big task, and it's an honor and a joy for me. It's the hardest exam in chiropractic. We have two of the toughest specialties in neurology are radiology and neurology, and I serve on one of those boards. I've also done the diplomate in QEEG. Thankfully, my mentor was Regine Eichler West, who is my hero, and she helped me become faculty to teach for Yuri. So I taught with the first group of Yuri's group several years ago in the beginning of COVID when we started our grand rounds with Yuri, and I've been part of that ever since. And I'm doing EEGs and ERPs for many years and neurofeedback of many types for many years. And one of my great interests has always been metabolism. I started out as a kid with eczema and lots of problems. And when I was 7 years old, my family put me on a elimination diet, and that helped me get better when the medical doctors couldn't help me. So naturally, I then became a chiropractor and got into mental health and got into brain health because chiropractors work on neurology and the brain and the spine and the spinal cord. And so I kind of merged into mental health very early with some psychiatrists I work with in Minnesota and in Missouri and other states in the United States, and began to lecture over time. Slowly as I built my skills, I began to lecture in the United States and Mexico and Europe, and my work began to be partly involved with the Carrick Institute. I did a lot of lab testing with people where we test blood and urine and saliva and hair. And of course, my big interest was toxicology. I graduated from Palmer College in Iowa in the United States with research honors in toxicology. So I was part of the toxicology department, and I studied toxicology quite a bit. And so to this day, I look at how important it is to study toxicology and mental health, and how we often allow DSM diagnoses to be put forth. And many times the DSM very clearly tells us if you meet all these criteria with all these time limits and you meet, 5 of 7 or 3 of 5 or 7 of 9 requirements, you now have this label of a DSM diagnosis. However, all of those DSM diagnoses have a caveat in there that says, and this problem is not caused by some other organic brain dysfunction. Well, what's an organic brain dysfunction? Gosh, an infection, a wound like a bullet wound or a fever, a chronic infection or an acute infection, a loss of blood, and anemia. There's many causes, an autoimmune disease, a thyroid disorder, an acute attack of a celiac disease or any other autoimmune disease. There's a whole bunch of reasons why a person may have confounded their DSM diagnosis and why their EEG might be affected. Now, it may be frustrating for some of you, and it is for me, that EEG, there's no direct correlation all the time between, one finding on the EEG and a point-to-point comparison. There's no one-to-one comparison where you say this wave means this deficiency. And it would be really nice and neat if we could just button it up and say, these alpha waves in this part of the brain are caused by this nutritional deficiency. And it isn't so, and it never will be. But there are a few things that we can hang our hat on, and I'll be going through those today and trying to show you the format. Usually we meet every other week for 2 hours in the States. It looks like we'll be meeting for 1 hour every month, every 4 weeks. for the next 6 months if we decide to go forward with this. And I would really love to do that for you. Our timing is opposite Jay Gunkelman's timing, and in the States it's opposite Yuri's timing. So we've all scheduled our work together so that we don't step on each other. And I'm always at Susan, so I'll see you there if you end up at Susan. I usually help with the work of putting that on and assist in presentations, or I am one of the moderators, or sometimes I present. But that's the general idea, is that your EEG, your EEG spectra, your ERP can be affected by your metabolism, by your toxins, by your red cells, your white cells, by your what you're eating. I do a lot of work that started out many years ago with ketogenic diets for children with seizure disorders. And I'll tell you that there's an awful lot we can do for seizure disorders that may not be known in the mainstream, because many of the many of the studies on ketogenic and carnivore diets were spiked. They were sabotaged because they were poorly designed from the beginning. Many vitamin studies from the 1960s and 70s were destroyed by poor design. Many of them studied people for only 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and it takes a minimum of 3 weeks to induce mineral retention by inducing something called metallothionein 3, which is a protein that carries minerals in the blood. It's been studied quite a bit in humans and horses, and it's something that needs to be induced, and it takes about 3 weeks. So if you do any mineral studies at all, like zinc or magnesium, you need to allow for 3 weeks for the ramping up of metallothionein so that the patient doesn't pee out or urinate out all of their minerals. So a design study that's less than 3 weeks long that involves any minerals or any B vitamins, of which minerals are a cofactor for, isn't going to work. And there were a number of studies that were published in the 1970s that lasted up to 3 weeks, and they said, see, vitamins and minerals don't work. They just create expensive urine, and it was all neat and tidy, and we don't have to study that anymore. And so that was how we sabotaged our study of nutrition in many ways. There was also a great deal of nutrition that came out in the 1950s by Harvard. When we wrecked the world with our study of cardiology, we basically taught that all fat is bad all the time, and that a high carbohydrate, high refined food diet was the safest one, and it was heart healthy. And we pushed on the world, and the world accepted our science, that grains were the foundation of nutrition, when that had never been the fact throughout all of history. We put out a food pyramid that killed a lot of people. We put out the idea that seed oils were heart healthy, and in fact, they're incredibly damaging. And so that was something that was really started in the 1950s in America, and it's our fault. So I'm going to do my best to try to reverse that and fix that with you, and try to come up with some of that stuff. And I will give you mechanisms as much as I can. I may have to do some homework and bring you more citations. I have some citations at the top of my head, many I don't, and I don't have a perfect memory. But if you ask me, I will bring you citations. I'll bring you YouTube channels. Perhaps my favorite is Low Carb Down Under, which is from you guys. Low Carb Down Under does a fantastic job of explaining in great detail with Low Carb Denver, these groups that are sister groups that meet, and they have cardiologists, they have lipidologists, they have medical doctors, they have psychiatrists, like Georgia Eid. They have just a ton of great people that talk about the nitty gritty science of what goes on in the brain. So our format is usually, the priority goes when we meet to who has the most urgent triage case and has labs. So we always start with, okay, who's got a lab and who's got the toughest case that's the most urgent. And so then we put that up, and we have you share that case. It'd be ideal if it's de-identified, because we like to record these and we like to disseminate these. So we'd like it de-identified. In some cases, when Nikki Wittridge manages our grand rounds in the States, he will de-identify if somebody happens to have an identified patient that hasn't been de-identified for the recording before it's released and posted on Dropbox. But we're working hard with the QEEG board, IQCB, to get continuing education credits for you, because this is an EEG, ERP, and metabolic type of thing, and we tie them together. So we spend a certain amount of time looking at the EEG, and sometimes the ERP, as well as looking at the lab labs and sometimes imaging. And we talk a lot about diet and detoxification and cleanses, and we use science to look at that. We don't have perfect science, but neurofeedback and EEG is not perfect science, but it's pretty darn good. There's a lot of literature on metabolism. There's a lot of literature on EEG. There's a lot of literature on toxins and clearance of the liver and pancreas and the intestines in phase one, phase two, and phase three detoxification. So I will be grounded in science all the time for you, and I may say some things that aren't completely proven, but generally I'll be giving you very, very strong science for nearly everything I talk about. And I've done this stuff for lots of people. I started out in a retreat center right out of chiropractic school. I worked in a retreat center that was 100 beds. 2,000 acres and a staff of 30. And I started out as, the low man on the totem pole, cleaning the toilets, and worked my way up to be the medical director in charge of the physical health, all the charts and all the recommendations and the essentially in charge of failures for cases when there was problems with this. And we had 100 beds, so families would come and stay, and they would stay there. And I tell you, whenever you're working on difficult patients or tough patients that have complex presentations, one of the best things to do is live with them. One of the best things to do is go to bed in your own cabins and wake up in the morning and see the patient at 6 o'clock in the morning or 7:30 in the morning, and see them on and off throughout the day. And then you go to bed at night after having them gone through classes and workshops and chiropractic adjustment visits and therapy and neurofeedback and counseling, all of which we did. Sometimes they would have colonics or enemas. Sometimes they would have cleanses. We had a visiting dentist. We had visiting physical therapists and chiropractors in residence. We had psychiatrists in residence. So we had quite a multidisciplinary team in the United States and Missouri back then in the Ozark Mountains. And so people would stay mostly during holidays was our biggest times, was the American holidays. And families would come and they would work on issues. They would work on anything from mental health, suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, cancers of various types, chronic disease mostly. We didn't treat cancer, but we did have cancer patients that would want to do certain diets. We were kind of a catch-all that took almost everything. And if it was chronic, we would work on it. So we did dietary and mental health. We did group and concept group and family group and family therapy. And I got to sit in on lots of group sessions and family sessions. And we had a hot seat where people would talk about their issues. So that's how I got introduced into mental health, even though I'm a chiropractic neurologist and not a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a therapist. And I'm also proud to say that my little sister has just gone through a wonderful midlife crisis where she went back to school and got a master's degree in therapy, and now she's a therapist. So she's a newly minted therapist in Minneapolis, starting out learning neurofeedback and learning EEG and learning counseling and learning therapy and doing very deep work with families. So it's really exciting to see that that's in the family. And I've got a family that goes back years and has pharmacists and chiropractors going back generations in the United States and Europe. So I have not visited Australia, but I was invited to before COVID, and then of course the world fell apart, and so all of that happened. But in any case, I will help you with vaccine injury. I will help you with the mechanisms of aluminum and detoxification. I will talk about the experts and who wrote about it, and we'll talk about dementia. We'll talk about reversing chronic disease. And we have a concept that I use called microdiagnosis, which is where we get to a diagnosis that's medical, but then we tear it apart and we look at what are the root causes. It's very important to look at root causes and mechanisms behind what's causing the actual diagnosis. We can't just stop with a diagnosis of migraine or a diagnosis of bipolar. We have to get deeper and find out, why does this person have that problem? And does it correlate with any other dual diagnoses like diabetes type 2 or oxidative stress or mercury poisoning or fluoride toxicity? There's a whole bunch of reasons why a person's brain may be dysfunctioning. And we want to find as much as we can historical evidence for that, laboratory evidence for that. And I'm also following my notes here. One of the things that we look at is labs, and that's a big part. But I also want to remind you that there's a whole lot of clinical science that's legitimate, but it doesn't have lab testing. And I'll spill the beans for you. The concept is that lectins are and anti-nutrients in foods are one of the biggest things that affect our patients and their brains and their immune system and their gut. And there's no great test for lectins and anti-nutrients. There are some good tests for things like oxalates. You can do great testing for oxalates in urine, but there's no great test for lectins. There's no great test for solanaceae, the nightshades. There's not great tests for these things. So some of them have to be done as an elimination diet. And because many of these plant proteins and other substances have a half-life of about 14 days. You're going to, if you have a certain amount of these built up in your intestine as undigested foreign protein antigens, mitogens or haptens, they will need to be broken down, and they'll be broken down 50% in 14 days, 50% in 14 days, 50% in 14 days. So if you've got a pound or two of undigested material in your intestine, clogging up the villi of the small intestine and the large intestine and the haustra of the large intestine, then it's possible that it could take multiple 2-week periods of having to get rid of that. Much as an animal decays in the street, when it dies on the street, it's got sunlight on it, and so that will accelerate the process of decay. But the protein in your stomach that's literally decaying, and not your stomach, your small intestine and large intestine, that's literally decaying, doesn't have the benefit of sunlight. So it takes time to decay and literally detach from the wall of the intestine and come out of your stool. So it could take a person 8 to 14 weeks of an elimination diet to really, really, really get all those dairy proteins or lectin proteins or plant proteins or whatever they need to get rid of out of their intestine. So that may give a problem. And in addition, we know that IgG antibodies take 6 months to come down after the stimulus to the immune system, the irritant is removed. So if a person has a persistent problem with autoimmunity or they've got an antibody reaction, it'll take a minimum of 6 months for that IgG immunoglobulin antibody to come down in the blood, and it could take much longer. So you'll find that for our elimination diet patients, for our autoimmune patients, will find that biology could take a period of time that takes a while. Certainly, as Jay Gunkelman would say, if we have problems in the insula reflects the intestines and the guts. And so it's very important that our gut feelings be addressed and that we use Jay Gunkelman's concept of looking at the phase reversals, where we look at phase reversals between temporal and cortex sites on the vertex, as well as a change in like C3, C4, P4, P3, so that phase reversal that Jay talks about helps us reveal that there might be an insular source, and we might need to do neurofeedback on the insula. And this is a chicken and egg problem where we don't really know, is the insula driving the gut problem because you injured your brain and you never had a gut problem before your brain injury? Or it's quite the opposite. Did you do something bad to your gut from your diet, and your gut got so bad that your gut border and your gut barrier got so bad that you ended up with a blood-brain barrier problem and you got a brain problem from your gut? Both are possible, I assure you, and I have treated both, and I have been wrong in both, where I started with one assumption and I tried to treat it and I was wrong and I had to flip. And I think a big part of being a consulting neurologist is all of my cases are referrals. Nobody walks in. I don't see the public. Everyone I see for the last decades has been referrals. So I am working on difficult cases all the time, and I don't always succeed at first. I sometimes go down a route and I fail with that route, and usually within weeks or just a few months, we figure out what that failure is, and we change it. Because part of ruling out something in diagnosis is doing a therapeutic trial. So very often you have to do a therapeutic trial to see if somebody has a problem. A great example of a very common therapeutic trial in mental illness is zinc supplementation. Very often we give people zinc supplements, and we know that it takes 3 weeks for metallothionein to be synthesized by the liver and by other tissues to keep the zinc and to use it and to distribute it to the 5 different areas of the body or chambers of the body where zinc is stored, and to ultimately get it to the zinc finger proteins in the hippocampus and other parts of the brain for memory and for memory formation and for processing. And so it's possible that we might need to spend 3 or 4 weeks with zinc supplementation. Now, that doesn't mean we can't do other things at the same time. It's just that the more things we try, the more difficult it is to figure out what the problem was. So we are constantly trying to figure out with these difficult patients, should we try multiple therapies at the same time because they're so sick, or should we try one therapy to try to rule out their diagnoses? And the most difficult patients that take the longest are the ones where you have to work through um, uh, uh, rule out after rule out after rule out after rule out because there's so many things wrong. And I have a number of those patients that I can tell you about. Most of them are not that bad, but the very, very most difficult ones, the smallest percentage, are the ones that take a long time. They have multiple problems, and they usually have SNPs. They usually have single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are inherited genes that make them susceptible to problems. It doesn't mean they're not fixable, and it doesn't mean that they are destined to just suffer. It means that they are unlucky in that they've been dealt a hand that they must deal with. And so that means that they have to be more strict with their diet, more strict with their detoxification, more strict with their supplementation. And there may be certain supplementations that everybody else can tolerate, like methyl B12, that they can't tolerate. There are a number of people that fit in the subcategory of can't tolerate folates, can't tolerate methyl B12. And that gets me to the category of some famous folks. Amy Yasko and William Walsh are both folks that I have studied. I've been a student of William Walsh for years in the Walsh Institute. In fact, let me just grab his book for you real quick. Um, so this is William Walsh's book. It's really important for mental illness, and in fact, he did something very similar to what Jay Gunkelman did. Jay created endophenotypes, 11 different endophenotypes of brain waves that are normal, but then can be abnormal if exaggerated. And over time, he proved them. And Nutrient Power takes the same thing. It's a very thin book, very easy to read for lay people. And William Walsh, PhD in biochemistry, he studied in Chicago, and he worked in Chicago for years in the Chicago prison system and treated over 30,000 patients with mental illness, 10,000 of which were in the Chicago prison system. And he looked at violent behavior, he looked at bipolar, he looked at all the standard mental illnesses that you deal with in your field, in your profession: depression, anxiety, bipolar, autism, schizophrenia. And he found that there were, 5 or 6 or so subtypes of biochemistry that could be divided in those people. And if you could identify them with lab tests, you could intervene and help them get better. And so he's published a lot of interesting stuff. He spent the last 8 years studying bipolar and the effects of the chemistry of oxidative stress. And so he's been using oxidative stress supplements to address this, because he's developed a theory that bipolar at its root around the world, regardless of race and gender and history, that all of the bipolar cases around the world manifest as an oxidative stress problem more than any other. And he believes he has enough evidence to prove that. So I've been his student for years. I've been part of his group and certified in his method from the walshinstitute.org. I wanted to share it with you. Many years ago, not too many years ago, part of my work was published in this neurology textbook. There's a chapter that about 10 of us from the Carrick Institute got together and wrote a chapter that was a published research article on brain injury and its diagnosis and treatment, and that became a chapter in this textbook by Jerry Leisman and Merrick. So just wanted to show that to you and get you understanding some of the things. I've written chapters in a couple of other books too. But that's for later. We can talk about all that junk later. I'd like to stop for a second and just ask if there's any burning questions or comments that anybody's got, or if anybody happens to have scared up a couple of lab tests, because I'll show you some anyway. If we have time, I've got some that I'll show you of my own. But I just wanted to ask if anybody has a lab test that they want to pop up, or a case they want to talk about where metabolism was related to their EEGs and their neurofeedback results and their counseling therapy results. Anybody have any comments?
I'm very interested how you to implement lab testing. I mostly work with one clinic as functional neurologist, like your discipline, and the other they do some of this, but the other clinic I work with mostly psychologists. I think they can expand to this different lab tests. Yeah, if you can share some resources on what.
Oh, yes. Thank you for bringing that up. This is a new development that's happened in the States. I don't know what's happening in Australia or New Zealand, but I know in the States that in the past there's been this siloing that was really caused, since 1910, 1911 with the Flexner Report in the United States, which was a way that industry began to control medicine, and it began to kind of make everybody into medical doctors and part of what they call Rockefeller medicine. And in that way, they closed down a lot of medical schools and they closed down the scope of practice and they shut down almost everything except chiropractic. And the only reason we survived was because we had our own private funding from the Palmer family. They were wealthy radio people that owned radio stations west of the Mississippi. And because they were incredibly wealthy, they could afford to avoid and create a separate and distinct profession. So chiropractic somehow stayed outside of medicine, even though everybody else kind of got scooped up and partitioned. And they said, you dentists can only deal with teeth now. You homeopaths have to go. You have to become medical doctors. All you therapists and mental health people, you can't deal with anything with the body. You can only counsel people. And so that partitioning and siloization was a big deal. And what it led to was a scope of practice where you can't touch people. You can't examine them with physical exam. You can't use a stethoscope. You can't palpate, auscultate, and percuss the abdomen. You can't look in the eyes. You can't do the stuff that a chiropractor and a medical doctor can do because you're in mental health. If you're a therapist, if you're a master's level or PhD level in counseling or psychology, you're not allowed to touch the body because you're only mind doctors, right? You can't do anything with the body, and that would include lab tests. So the history of this lab test phenomenon was that you couldn't do any of that. Well, something that happened and emerged during COVID was really interesting, and it was the idea that um, uh, only a licensed physician with a National Practitioner Institute number, an NPI, National Provider Institute number, could order lab tests that only a medical doctor or a chiropractor or an osteopath could order a x-ray or an MRI or a lab test. And so what began to happen was all these lab companies began to realize that, hey, if more people want to do lab testing, we need to find a way to get around that. And so now naturopaths and natural doctors and non-doctors and therapists and coaches and everyone in your scope of practice in the United States at least can now use something like Rupa Health. Now, I'm not trying to endorse Rupa Health as a tool. It's just one of many tools, but it's a good example of one of the first companies that got out there. And what they did is they're an aggregator. So it's a company that has a bunch of labs. So Genova, Mosaic, all these different labs, Dutch laboratory, all these different laboratories that do blood and urine and saliva and hair. All these different labs are now available in one site. And so the doctors loved that because they said, wow, I can go on one site and I can order everything I need. I can order blood and I can order urine and I can order hair. I can have collection kits sent to the patient's home, and they can collect their own hair and stool and urine, and they can go to a draw site and get their blood drawn, and I can get my results. And that was the first step, was aggregating all these together. The second step, which was really exciting, was they began to realize that, hey, if we just have a medical doctor sign off on these labs, if there's a pathology on them, for an extra $10 fee. It started at $25 and then it became $10. If we can do that, we now defer all of the liability so that a therapist or a non-doctor who's ordering these things is no longer on the hook for practicing medicine without a license. So they started saying, well, we'll just, if you're a non-practitioner without a license, to practice medicine or to make a physical diagnosis or to do a physical exam or to interpret and make a physical diagnosis, like, you guys are allowed to make a DSM diagnosis, but you're not allowed to make a diagnosis of something like Hashimoto's thyroiditis or diabetes type 2. You're not allowed to make that diagnosis. You're allowed to make diagnoses within the DSM of mental health. And so now what happened was all these Americans could go and they could, and in Europe, could use these aggregators and have a medical doctor sign off on them. And now the likes of you could order these tests, have them delivered to you, and you could say, well, I don't interpret them. I'm not telling you what a diagnosis is. The medical doctor is responsible for pathology. But if you want to look at your mental health and you want to use this as some kind of coach thing and talk about general health, you can do that. Go ahead. Did somebody want to say something? No? Okay. Jump in any time if you want to comment. But so that's a really exciting opportunity. Now, does anybody know if that's allowed in Australia or New Zealand, or if it is something, it's a thing? Because in the States, it's definitely a thing and it works and it's wonderful. And in Europe, it works quite a bit.
It would be
Um,
outside the scope of practice for psychology in Ontario, Canada.
oh, in Canada. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah. Well,
was
these,
wondering what an oxidative stress problem, how does that show up in the
oh, so
EEG?
an
How does
oxidative
it show
stress.
up in labs?
Yeah, great question. The probably the there's not a single there's not a single marker for oxidative stress. The probably the most accurate marker for oxidative stress is a very obscure one in urine, and it's part of an organic acid test, and it's called 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine. 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine, 8-OHDH, H8-OHDG. And this 8-hydroxydeoxyguanosine is a very good measure of oxidative stress in the body. And so oxidative stress is a subcategory of inflammation. It's not the same thing as inflammation, but it very much looks and smells like inflammation and acts like inflammation. So, inflammatory pathways are broad, and there are many and several different kinds of inflammation. But oxidative stress has to do with reactive oxygen species and metabolism. It has to do with whether oxygen is toxic. It has to do with deuterium depletion and mitochondria. It has to do with exposure to volatile organic compounds that cause free radicals like exhaust fumes, like smelling benzene or gasoline or other fumes like volatile organic compounds in paint or paint thinner. So there's many, many kinds of oxidative stress, and there's even more kinds of inflammation. But oxidative stress can come from internally from your own metabolism being messed up, or it can come externally from things that you put into your body that are oxidatively stressful, that change oxygen and electrons, and that's a big part of what say Jack Cruz or Alexis Cowan or Max Ghislaine talk about on YouTube, which has to do with sun and infrared and ultraviolet exposure versus blue light, non-native EMFs, and EMF exposure. So it's very possible that your mitochondria could be exposed to things that are not necessarily food or that are food that lead to really bad oxidative stress in the mitochondria. And that would be blue light. In fact, there are research studies that have been published that show that blue light causes diabetes all by itself. Non-native EMF blue light 400 to 550 nanometers causes diabetes. So oxidative stress can be caused by light pollution. It can be caused by improper deuterium production from diets that are high in carbohydrates. It can be caused by uh, exposure to environmental toxins like again, exhaust fumes and chemicals in the environment. It's a good question, but I don't know in Canada if there is this aggregator called RUPA, because if you have a medical doctor signing off and interpreting the results, then now there's no longer any problem with a patient getting it themselves or with a therapist making the order. So it's pretty cool to have that ability now in many parts of the world. So I don't know how fast it'll spread. I don't know if it's active in Australia, but that's the general concept. So when we look at a patient's EEG spectra, we need to look at say low frequencies. Let's say we have excessive low frequencies. Now you guys are familiar, those of you that read EEG, you know that low frequencies that in an adult, when somebody's got excessive delta, excessive theta in both eyes open and closed condition throughout all the sites of their brain, we call that something. Do you guys know what that's called in neurology? Is everybody aware of what we call that, the phenomenon? We usually call that metabolic encephalopathy. So metabolic encephalopathy would be defined as elevated beyond 2 or 3 standard deviations from the mean, delta waves, theta waves in eyes open and closed condition throughout the brain, not just regional. That would be a global or brain-wide metabolic encephalopathy to a neurologist or a epileptologist or a medical doctor that's reading an EEG. It has to qualify to be called metabolic encephalopathy. Metabolic encephalopathy can be caused by a lot of things, but it sure sounds like what we're talking about today. It can be caused by fever. infection with or without fever. It can be caused by heavy metal toxins or other toxins like pesticides, herbicides. It can be caused by a diabetic attack or an acute problem of insulin, either hypo or hyperglycemia. It can be caused by an autoimmune storm, like a person that has Hashimoto's thyroiditis in an autoimmune storm, particularly Graves' disease, which you see very frequently in people. They have autoimmune storms and they act completely wildly crazy with Graves' disease. It's not uncommon to see that happen with uncontrolled Graves' disease. You see that sometimes in something called cryptopyrroluria. Cryptopyrroluria is a condition that's partly genetic. It's a disorder of zinc and vitamin B6 metabolism, where the hemoglobin process of forming heme affects porphyrin rings, and the patient makes a cryptopyrrole in their blood, which is something that affects their brain, and they begin to hallucinate. They actually hear voices that are not there, and they may be diagnosed with schizophrenia or other type of split from reality, and they have cryptopyrroles elevated in their urine. We see this frequently in children and sometimes in adults. And with elevated cryptopyrroles, we need to change their diet and give them vitamin B6 and zinc, and we can often reverse this terrible experience of hallucination. They can hallucinate sounds and voices. They can hallucinate visions. They can think that they're being told what to do by God or by some other entity. They really can have some real problems. So just know that there's a lot of things that can cause an organic brain dysfunction that can lead to metabolic encephalopathy. And they're usually fairly acute episodes of a metabolic disorder or a poisoning of some kind. You can get it from anemia. You can get it from liver. The most famous is from liver toxicity or kidney toxicity. You may have heard of liver flap when a patient presents with triphasic waves throughout their brain in a random fashion and very flatline EEG, and their hands are flapping. That's called liver flap, and that's not necessarily the same metabolic encephalopathy. It is a very serious form of metabolic encephalopathy, but what you see is these giant triphasic waves throughout the brain randomly with a relatively flatline EEG, and the patient is usually flailing. And so you see that liver flap, which is a toxic liver. We don't know necessarily what the cause is, but there are many causes of acute hepatitis. We can see these in acute pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is a big deal. It kills about 10% of people that get it. And pancreatitis happens in your pets, it happens in your animals, it happens in humans and children. And there are many causes of pancreatitis, but acute pancreatitis will show up in blood enzymes that can be ordered, but they're not part of a normal panel. So sometimes we have to special order amylase and lipase, which are in blood, to see if a person has an acute pancreatic episode. Now, what's really very interesting is there's another kind of pancreatitis called chronic pancreatitis. And chronic pancreatitis is not the same as acute pancreatitis, and there's no blood changes. There's no blood changes, but the pancreas has been irritated. The patient often is very thin. They love to not eat, and they will not eat for many days because they feel better when they don't eat. They often have a terrible rash and pain around their pancreas, which is the upper midriff. So it might be a little bit above where you wear a cummerbund, about where your pancreas is. These patients have a rash. They have pain around their abdomen if you touch their pancreas area, which is just below their ribs. They are in terrible pain, and they often will binge because they get so hungry that they need to binge. And of course, they will be exhausted, and they'll present to an emergency room, and they'll be blood tested, and they'll be told, you don't have acute pancreatitis, you have chronic pancreatitis. Go home and eat many small meals, and it'll take you about a year to recover. And that's usually about what happens if they do a good job and they're lucky. They'll have to take digestive enzymes because they've had a depleted pancreas for years. And so medicine doesn't do a very good job of managing these patients. They just kick them out of the emergency room and say, go forth and eat less, eat smaller meals so that you need less bile, and hope that you recover. And these patients do very well if they're managed properly. If they eat small meals and they give digestive enzymes and they learn about their pancreas, they can recover. But it does take months to recover from chronic pancreatitis. But it is not the same thing as acute pancreatitis. It's very common, and you'll see it in many people that present with abnormal brain waves and mental health conditions and diet problems. So realize that when we see metabolic encephalopathy, we got to figure out what's the problem. We also see another form of of brainwave that's very common in EEG, which is the low voltage, high frequency. Many of you have seen low voltage, high frequency, where we called it ants on a page, where it looks like ants are crawling around the page, and we just see very high frequency, low amplitude, low voltage, and that's low power. That's low oxidative phosphorylation. And oxidative phosphorylation, or the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle, the production of ATP is messed up, and the person does not have efficient oxidative phosphorylation for whatever reason, and they can't produce energy and they can't run their brain. And so these are often highly intelligent people. Often there's a tendency toward addiction in these patients. They often are very highly functioning people and very smart, but they have low voltage, and they tend toward addiction, and they tend toward other behaviors, and they have poor brain energy. So those are people that often need metabolic help. They need to be assessed. They often are deficient in minerals. They often are insulin resistant. They often are hypoglycemic at episodes. They often have other problems in their blood work, and you can usually find it in their medical history. And we've been able to remedy that. It's not just a genetic tendency. It's very often a metabolic problem that happens in adults and children, and it needs to be addressed, because low voltage, high amplitude, or I'm sorry, low voltage, low amplitude, high frequency is a real problem. Many of you have also seen people with just excess delta waves. They have excess delta waves in certain regions of their brain. That person may have injury, and they may have cortical injury or white matter injury. Usually it's white matter injury, and they have excess delta in a certain region. Those patients often do quite well with omega-3 supplementation. They do well with, in many cases, increased saturated fat. They need increased dietary saturated fat, which is going to make certain cardiologists just cringe and pucker whenever they hear me say that. But I assure you that there's a lot of evidence for that. Now, we don't want to mix those saturated fats with a high carbohydrate, high simple processed food diet. Obviously, we don't want to do that. We're going to create a cardiac nightmare. But we want to try to look at nudging these folks over to different things. Now, I'm not against people, if they want to be vegan or vegetarian, or if they want to do, there's a couple of diets out there that are like rice based. If you want to do that, there is some evidence that if you follow it correctly, you can be healthy. But I don't see a lot of evidence for that. My bias, and I'll share with you my bias, is toward the carnivore keto world. I tend to have much more success with that. I have done keto vegan diets for my patients, where we do a keto vegan type of diet, and I've been successful at helping with seizure disorders and reducing seizure disorders when keto is done properly. Certainly, we want to identify seizure disorders. We want to identify unstable brain cells, and we advocate the use and identification of this so that patients can be medicated. And we know that medicating people with anti-seizure medication can be helpful, even in small doses, for people with very small amounts of seizure disorder. But I would advocate that we try to not use medication, that we try to use a ketogenic diet for these children as they're growing up, and I think we can get good results. And I've proven that. I've also had many cases where we had to reduce their antigenic foods in patients that were either celiac in their intestine or celiac in their brain. Now, some of you may not be familiar with this, but there's a genetic test, HLA DQ2 and DQ8 are different genes, and one is for the small intestine, the classic celiac disease, and the other one is for celiac of the brain. And so these are patients that respond very poorly to dairy proteins and to gluten proteins, much like the thyroid patients. And any kind of gluten protein, or any kind of antigen that's similar to gluten, which is almost any grain, will set them off, and they'll have brain problems or gut problems or both. And you can test for this with a cheek swab. It's a DNA test that will test for DQ2 or DQ8 genes, and this will give you an idea if they have a tendency toward these problems. And I've been successful at reducing seizures in a number of patients that have tested for this, and we get them off of those foods. And if we're very strict, they do extremely well and without medication, because the cause of their problem is an immune reaction, a genetic-based immune reaction. We also see high frequencies. Many of you are familiar with beta spindling. Beta spindling was really pioneered quite a bit by Ron Swatsina in Houston, Texas. He wrote a bunch of papers about it, and he's using it as a biomarker for anxiety and inflammation. And beta spindling responds really well to reducing inflammation processes in the body. Some of that's dietary, some of that's toxic. Quite a bit of it is mold. A number of my students and learners have found patients with beta spindling get better after they do mold testing. They do a urine test for mold toxins. These are mycotoxins that are gases produced by mold. And mind you, the mold is not usually living in the patient. Usually the mold is living in a water damaged building that they live or work in. It could be their home, their bathroom, their kitchen, their attic, their basement, their workplace, their car, their garage, whatever it is. And the mold lives in the house, in the water damaged part of the house, but they breathe in those mycotoxins and they get terrible problems. Black molds, aspergillus and ochratoxin, these are terrible. They cause organ failure, they cause cancer, they cause autoimmune disease. They're a big deal. They cause people to get organ replacements. So very often the EEG is the first thing that tells us that somebody's got a problem. That leads to urine testing for mold. Then we identify the source of mold from the sick building syndrome or the water damaged building, and voila, the patient gets better and their whole family gets better. And we've averted a disaster by finding black mold. So that's a big deal and something that we do quite a bit in our work here in the States and in Europe with my students and my learners, my colleagues. And by the way, you guys are going to teach me more than I'll ever teach you. One of the greatest things I get out of this class is I learn from you, and you tell me all kinds of cool stories of what's going on and what you're doing with people and what kind of neurofeedback you're doing and what kind of therapies you're doing. One of my students recently had a patient that had carbon monoxide poisoning, and they found that it was carbon monoxide poisoning in their house. And they used a carbon monoxide detector, and they identified these terrible headaches the patient was having. It was carbon monoxide from their faulty heater in their house. So, this is a world I want to open you up to of what we call organic brain dysfunction. That is something that's very big, and you can do it. Now, I realize that there are some bean counters in certain countries that are going to tell you this is out of your scope of practice. I'm not asking you to diagnose patients. I'm not asking you to do a physical exam and listen to a heart, right? Like a chiropractor or a medical doctor would. I'm not asking you to interpret blood tests for diagnosis. I'm asking you to think about opening your mind into what could be a differential diagnosis that they could investigate with their doctor and that they might figure out. And you might be the first person to get them to that point. You're not going to make the final diagnosis. You're just going to open their mind to testing and open their mind to the possibility of testable and non-testable entities and things that could happen to them. So frequently we do anti-inflammatories. I'll give somebody with beta spindles, I'll give them a diet that's an anti-inflammatory diet. I'll take them off of seed oils that are inflammatory and rancid, processed seed oils, processed grains, processed foods. I'll take them off of grains, beans, nuts, and seeds for lectins. I'll take them on a lower carbohydrate diet. I may ask them to take herbs that are anti-inflammatory, like Boswellia serrata. I might give them turmeric or curcumin. I might give them black cumin seed oil. There's a number of natural anti-inflammatories that have been proven to be part of a biochemical cascade that helps the liver's phase 1 and phase 2 oxidative and conjugative pathways to detoxify toxic elements and to reduce inflammation. There are a number of these things that have been well proven to be anti-inflammatories and antioxidants. William Walsh, to answer your question earlier about oxidative stress, he gives N-acetylcysteine and superoxide dismutase producers, which can be bought in bottles and also fostered in food choices and food diets. So N-acetylcysteine, superoxide dismutase, and a number of other things, but those are the main big supplements that are his core for treating oxidative stress. Glutathione certainly is one of the best things for helping with oxidative stress. And there's many others. Omega-3, perhaps the best, believe it or not, the best sleeper supplement or food that's oxidative antioxidant, believe it or not, are you ready for this? This is a weird one. Saturated fat. Now, why in the world is saturated fat something that's an antioxidant? The reason for it is there's very few sites on saturated fat where there's a free oxygen. So there can't be oxidative stress in a saturated fat. So it's very important that when a person has healthy saturated fats and they're not having a very high glycemic diet, they're not giving themselves tons of processed foods to process, they're not giving themselves artificial colors, flavors, and preservatives, which are known as haptens or mitogens, which stimulate massive amounts of oxidative stress. They're not exposed to a ton of blue light, which will generate reactive oxygen species. When they live right, they can handle tremendous amounts of saturated fat, like the Eskimo and the Inuit. In fact, I went and visited the Sami tribe in northern Sweden in 2005 a couple times, and I got a chance to hang out with them. And I got to eat reindeer, and I got to hear about how they eat fat and watch them eat fat and eat fat with them. The Sami are amazing people, very much like the Inuit and Eskimo in Alaska and northern Canada. And in Siberia, the Russian tribes, I can't remember all their names, but Sami is one of the names of the tribes up in Russia and Siberia and Finland and Norway. So I got to hang out with those people. There's been lots of studies on this. So when you're dealing with beta spindles, it's pretty clear in the literature that beta spindles can represent anxiety, but they can also represent inflammation, and they can be focal. Now, I want to tell you, I've tested this out because I thought to myself, well, everybody thinks that something global that shows up in the whole brain is probably metabolic, and if it's focal, it's probably not metabolic. So I started to challenge that, and I started to take people with focal problems where there was only beta spindles in a certain place or delta waves in a certain place or ischemia from slow edge of alpha in certain places. And I would take them to Jay Gunkelman and I would say, all right, Jay, here's an EEG on this patient. And then I would treat them without neurofeedback. I would do dietary work and supplements, and then I would do a follow-up EEG some months later, and I would bring it back to Jay, and I would say, let's do a comparison, because I have private lessons with Jay, and we would do comparison function on WinEEG software. And so we would do comparison for prior current compared to prior, and we would get a graph, and Jay would walk through this and say, this is more than clinically significant. This is not random. You're making changes in these people's brains, and focal lesions are getting better from dietary interventions. And so I hate to mess up your preconceived notions of the world, but I sure messed my own up, because I realized that in some cases, focal lesions could improve from dietary interventions, supplementation, detoxification, and various types of things. And I realized we need a lot more data, but I've done some preliminary work on this and I'm seeing it. And Jay will tell you, I'm not lying. We're doing the same thing with Uri, with ERPs, only I'm just getting into high quality ERPs. I've been doing EEGs forever, but I'm just getting into high quality ERPs. I've done some ERPs of lower quality in the past, but I really didn't do the high quality measured against the database standard, which I want to do and am doing with Uri now. So I have a lot more work to do, but we all need to do this work. In fact, I would like to have a guest on. I've got some friends who are editors of journals and who have institutional review boards that can help with science. I want all of you to get published. I want all of you to get case studies and case series published. If you want to do research, I have connections of funding sources and of equipment and of IRBs. So if you want to do RCT trials, but you want to get into that world, we can get into that. But you first need to study case studies and case series. So if you want to get published, it can be done. And I'd like to all of you have cool cases that you're chomping at the bit to tell the world about, and we want to make it frictionless so that you can do that. So that opportunity exists. And gosh, that's a lot of stuff. Again, I want to stop and see if there's any questions. We've done almost an hour now. I've been talking incessantly. It's not the mic show. Grand Rounds is about talking and sharing, and usually, a presenter presents their case. They talk a lot. We ask questions, and we all just learn to ask better questions, because Grand Rounds is. I'll end with Grand Rounds is really two things. All Grand Rounds, and I've led many Grand Rounds for different universities, all Grand Rounds is two questions. You're either questioning, is the diagnosis correct and we have to revisit it or not? Or is the diagnosis correct and the treatment is not correct and we have to revisit the treatment? And within the treatment, we're asking, is it the right treatment, but the dose is incorrect? Because many times we got the diagnosis right, we got the treatment right, but we got the dose wrong. And if we abandon the treatment because we got the dose wrong, we've made it 2/3 of the way there, but we haven't finished that last part. So the dose of therapy, which whether it's supplements, diet, food, detoxification, or neurofeedback, all of that can be dosed like a drug. So it's about diagnosis, treatment, and dose. All of that is really all we do in grand rounds. Grand rounds, no matter what you're doing, whether it's metabolic grand rounds or whether it's orthopedic grand rounds or neurology grand rounds or hematology grand rounds, it's all those three questions. And so that's what we're learning is we're learning to ask better questions. And a successful grand rounds, the end of the session means that we come away with better questions to ask and concrete solutions. What lab test am I going to run next? What neurofeedback am I going to try? What dietary intervention am I going to make? What hypothesis do I have that can be testable? It's all about a testable hypothesis. And that means that sometimes you don't have a lab, but you can do an elimination diet, or you can do a cleanse, or you can do a therapeutic trial of a supplement, and you can see if it changes the brain. And I encourage you to do pre and post EEGs. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do neurofeedback, but I've done cases without neurofeedback to prove that metabolism is related. And so with that, I need to ask if you have any questions. It's been a joy to talk with you. I really hope we can meet monthly and follow the schedule that Rustam has created for us. So any questions, any comments?
I'm quite interested in looking at the epigenetic issues. I think there's not enough work done in clinics.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Well, I hope you all like this, and I hope you all are interested in signing up. I'd very much like to do this following the schedule that's been created by Rustam and his team. And I really welcome your questions. I can't wait to meet all of you. Eventually, I'd like to come to Australia and meet everyone. My desire now, though, is to help every one of you become more skilled clinicians. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Barbara, did you want to comment?
I was like, I found very interested in the genetic component and how that plays into the holistic situation.
I'm having trouble with your sound.
Genetics.
Genetics?
Genetics.
Yeah, genetics. If your question was about genetics, we will do some SNP analysis and we'll also do some pharmacogenetics. We'll be looking at the tolerance of psychoactive drugs like psychiatrists do, which is a separate test from SNPs. And we will talk about SNPs. If we go into the weeds on SNPs, we're going to be going into Snipedia, which is a website that helps you understand the RS number and how to understand what is known and what is not known about each SNP. And there's a lot of SNPs. So it's daunting. It's very difficult. The good news is there's a lot you can do outside of SNPs. There's a whole lot you can do. But sometimes with really tough cases, we do wade into SNPs. And I like to use Amy Yasko's work, which is knowyourgenetics.com. And Amy Yasko is a famous American immunologist who has done a great deal of work on autism and SNPs. Yasko is her last name, Amy Yasko. I've studied her work for years. And I will introduce that to you if you wish. She has reversed the non-speaking autistic patients and brought their speech back by looking at dopamine pathways and SNPs. And she's the one that talks about not using methyl B12 in some cases and using adenosyl B12, not using folates in certain cases, and talking about all that. And I'll unpack that for you later if you wish. I hope that was what you were talking about, Barbara. I couldn't hear you very well.
I think she did mention genetics. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's it. That was amazing. I'm really excited discovering these metabolic rounds. What's that about? I think it's so important to implement this tests and how we add them to EEG interpretation and our protocol treatment, brain training, all kind of things. Well, fantastic.
You also get a big file from me when we start. You'll be a share file, a Dropbox shared file where we created a shared file of resources, and I dump a ton of stuff in there that you can use as resources. And we just started a project of dividing it into for clinicians, which is for you clinicians, and another one that would be for you to distribute and disseminate to your patients and your clients, so that it's more like tools to use with your clients. And we're just now splitting that Dropbox into two pieces. And I may need your help with that as a group. And we want you to participate. If you have a cool resource that you found something cool on thyroid or something, and you want to share it with the group, we want you to share it with the administrator and put that in the shared file, because we want to make this a growing set of resources. And I do privates too. I do privates as well, but I'd like to do this for you because it's a lot more cost effective, to do a group type of thing. And you learn a lot from other people's cases. When you see other people's cases, you learn a heck of a lot by seeing other people's cases. And if you want to just lurk for a while and not bring any cases, you can do that. You don't have to bring a case, but it's really nice if you either bring somebody to talk about, or if you go to the top level and you bring some labs. And that's really, really cool. Now, I always have a hierarchy of, I start medical, which means I start with a CBC and chem profile if I can, and then I proceed to other specialty labs. However, if you come in and you've got a case and all you've got is a stool test, or all you've got is a urine test, or all you've got is a hair test, we'll start there, and that's okay. And then I'll tell you how I would work through that case and what I would go back and do, and backfill in the case. Like, I would go back and do these blood tests because they weren't done, or I would tell you I'm worried about this, or I would say, we have a differential diagnosis, the rule out of this. And so we'll talk about that. Again, I can't be your doctor, and I can't register a second opinion legally, but I will give you lots of questions. And after a while, you guys will be really good at asking questions, and some of you are probably already really good at it. And I can't wait to hear. Everybody's so quiet today. I haven't heard much from you, and I really want to hear from you all. But Rustam, any other comments or questions? We're going over time. I don't want to abuse your time. Our
No, I
next
think
meeting
that's
is in 2 weeks.
fantastic. Anyone has questions, please say so. Looks like good. We probably need to absorb all this information, Michael. This was amazing. Thank you for all this wealth of experience and knowledge that you shared with us. I think it will be fantastic group. I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah,
Well,
and
yeah.
I'm donating some of our proceeds to your organization, so I'm very pleased about that, and we'll do more as time goes by. And we'll do all kinds of neat stuff for the community. Like I said, I'll really help you with research. I'll have a couple of guests on sometime to talk about research and funding and publishing case studies and case series. I really want you all to publish your cool cases because you've all got them. I know you all have them.
So do we have to do the lab to organize lab testing? Like, I've got a case of young boys with the spikes, which are kind of unknown origin. So it'll be good to run tests, and if you recommend those, yeah.
Yeah, we want to look for, we don't know exactly what the cause is, but we want to open the metabolic world and look for what could be contributing. And I'll go through all those possibilities with you as best I can. And I make mistakes too, but I usually figure them out pretty quickly. And the whole art of being a consulting neurologist is to figure out quickly how to get back on track, because you do make mistakes, and you do go down avenues that are wrong, and that's part of specialty work. That's normal.
There's a question. Joanna has a hand up.
Oh, is there a hand up? Okay, go ahead. Oh, I see
Yeah.
that. I see now. I see. Go ahead, Joanna. Thank you. Sorry.
So I want to share that I really find it fascinating and important. I'm really glad what you are bringing and this perspective. And my doubt is that I don't have enough actually it's not my level that to join, and I wonder if you will repeat this later, because I need to first focus on some other areas.
Oh, sure, yeah. We've been doing this for
yeah?
years, so yeah, you can join later.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. Yep.
Thank
You can join later if you need to. It's sometimes people take breaks and they drop out and they join back up. I've been doing this for years, and we've got a number of people that have gone in and out, and some go in privates with me and they only do privates, and some only do the group, and some do both. It's all okay. I'm in the Denver time zone, mountain US time zone. So yeah. No problem.
Thank
No
you.
problem. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so just a little information about further meetings. So our grand round starts on the 19th of April, and there's registration. I'm going to send you all the link. You can find on the events on the DMMI website, braininstitute.com.au. So there'll be this quite affordable, $360 for 6 meetings. I think that's enormous value. And yeah, please register and send your questions to Michael via me or directly. And hope to see you all on the 19th of April.
Yeah, well, I hope to see you all in 2 weeks, and I'm really excited, and I'd love to meet you all. I can't wait to see what your practices are and what your specialties are and what your populations are. And it's really exciting to see people get better. And by the way, many times the learners also get better because they bring their own labs, and you're welcome to do that too. You're welcome to bring your own personal labs if you choose. No invasion, but if you want to, you can do that. And this is a great place to do that to get your own health better. And many of our American and European colleagues do that as well. And they've changed their lives. Many of them have really changed their lives by getting on grand rounds and presenting themselves as a case. And it's really quite exciting. And it's really fulfilling to see your patients get better and your own self and your families get better. So that's fair game. If you want to have yourself or your spouse or one of your children or one of your parents get on, they don't have to be on. We don't have to see the patient. We're discussing the case. The patient never has to be on, the client. But they're always welcome. But it's about going over their record. We're not here to necessarily see their face, although we can. But it's about the case and going over the record.
Okay, so I will create a Dropbox folder for cases like we do with other mentoring classes. Everyone can share cases, and then I'll send them to Michael, and he might recommend certain
Yeah.
lab test or something. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll find out what labs available in Australia and some of them international. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Yeah, thank you. Feel free to email me, let me know what you think and what you need and what you want. Some of it'll be mini lectures, some of it'll be questions. And by the way, you could present a case without having any labs. You can just show the EEG or not and talk about who you're doing neurofeedback on and just tell us about them. And we can talk about that. It's ideal if we have labs, but if we don't have labs, it's okay. We can still talk about diet and food and make suggestions and ideas. We're not diagnosing them or treating them. We're just making suggestions and possibilities. So we don't have to have labs if you don't have labs. You can still bring up a case.
Well, thank you, Michael. That's amazing. So the great new avenue for us to learn more about EEG and the brain. Well,
Yeah.
we'll see you on the 19th of April. I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you all. It's so much fun. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Michael.